Okay, I think I'm back. This may be a second recording. Let's see how I do with the technology. I want to share with you the views of Stuart Eisenstadt. Eisenstadt was part of the Carter administration. He was the chief of staff of domestic policy to Jimmy Carter. He then went on to serve in the State, Commerce, and Treasury departments under Bill Clinton. So he had an article back in 2015 that was run in the New York Times called Jimmy Carter's Unheralded Legacy. Let me share with you some of what he writes. He thinks that Carter has been caricatured as a failure. He's been marginalized, he says, even by fellow Democrats since he left office in 1981. Eisenstadt thinks his defining characteristic was confronting intractable problems regardless of their political cost. Hamilton Jordan, says Eisenstadt, who was also a close aide, arguably Carter's closest aide, used to joke that the worst argument to make to Carter to dissuade him from action was to tell him that it would hurt him politically. So here is Eisenstadt's counting of positive things that Carter accomplished. First, Carter understood that he was the first post-Watergate president. Remember, Ford took over from Nixon. Carter's elected in '76. So Carter imposed gift limits and financial disclosure rules on his appointees. He slowed the revolving door of officials departing to lobby their former departments and appointed inspector generals to root out fraud and mismanagement. Secondly, Carter established the Department of Education and increased college tuition grants for needy students. He ended federal price regulation of trucking, interstate buses, railroads, and airlines. As an aside, I was able to go to college because of Pell Grants that I got at the time. So I, for one, was appreciative of that. And I think in hindsight, even though some presidents have tried to abolish the Department of Education, Reagan talked about doing it, Trump talked about doing it, it's an important part of the government. Thirdly, Eisenstadt talks about energy policy. Carter tried repeatedly to put in a mindful energy policy that would have lowered America's dependence on imported oil. Eisenstadt writes as follows. He says, America's energy outlook would not be as bright as it is today were it not for his, that is Carter's, dogged determination to awaken the American public and Congress to the dangers of our growing dependence on foreign oil. He broke a quarter-century impasse and began to phase out federal price controls for natural gas and then crude oil. He created a Department of Energy and began tax incentives for home insulation for solar energy. Next point. Eisenstadt argues that Carter created the modern vice presidency. He made Mondale a partner. He gave him an office close to his own. He gave Mondale access to classified documents and involved him in every major decision. Before Mondale, the vice presidency was considered an awful job. Lyndon Johnson once described it as not, forgive my language, of not being worth a glass of warm piss. Lyndon Johnson felt that he was there to go to funerals and represent the United States. Mondale, and then after him, you see Bush was an important vice president, and subsequent vice presidents, Biden, Cheney under W. Bush. I think the one exception to it was Dan Quayle, not much of a vice president, right? Al Gore was very much a partner with Clinton. So Carter changed the dynamics between the president and vice president. Eisenstadt continues, and he's very correct, I think, in this thing. Carter's greatest achievements were in the realm of foreign policy. We'll talk in just a couple minutes in more depth about the Camp David Accords that he put into place to achieve peace between Israel and Egypt. In Asia, he took on the Taiwan lobby. He established full diplomatic relations with China, which completed the opening that Nixon had begun. In Latin America, he ushered in what Eisenstadt calls a new era of mutual respect by turning over the Panama Canal to local control, limited arms sales to military dictatorships. And he, lastly, he made human rights a cornerstone of his foreign policy. So in hindsight, these are not insignificant achievements, especially again in foreign policies. This is sort of, I would consider backroom work, creating Department of Energy, creating Department of Education. And so they're important, but they really don't add up to be enough to overcome the negatives or the negative perception about Carter. So Eisenstadt asked this question, why is a Carter presidency viewed with such disdain? So Eisenstadt makes two arguments. He says, firstly, there was Carter's style of governing. He had what Eisenstadt calls an unbending character. So it says, for instance, early in his presidency, Carter was trying to manage the White House on his own without a chief of staff. So Carter sent to Congress a blizzard of controversial legislative proposals. By his own admission, this overloaded the congressional circuits with too many competing initiatives. What came back paled in contrast to his excessively broad goals and confused the public. By the way, you can see the parallels because Trump has gone through 3 or 4 chiefs of staff, and even those who serve, everyone acknowledges that Trump calls his own shots. What's interesting is many presidents, arguably successful presidents, are able to make a half a loaf seem like a victory. Carter didn't. He looked it says, Eisenstadt, when Carter won, he looked as if accepting compromise was a loss. What Carter did what he considered the right thing for his country and let the political chips fall where they may. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect, Eisenstadt argues, and I think this is also correct, the fruits of some of Carter's greatest achievements came only after he left office. For example, Carter appointed Paul Volcker, as I mentioned, chairman of the Federal Reserve. He knew that Volcker would raise interest rates to squeeze out inflation. But he did it because it was the right thing. Eisenstadt also says, to this day, there's a myth, which Carter himself has not tried to dispute, that if only he had dispatched more helicopters, our attempt to rescue the American hostages held at our embassy in Iran would have succeeded. Military commanders, in fact, argued that additional helicopters would have compromised the secrecy of the mission. Again, who knows, but it became a metaphor for his failed presidency. So the lesson here is, even with some significant accomplishments, accomplishments that if we look back objectively today are in fact significant. You had these 2 major crises which cost him re-election and label him as an ineffective president. So let me talk a little bit in depth about the 2 accomplishments that Eisenstadt talked about. Let's start with human rights. I want to share with you some information about Carter's accomplishments in the area of human rights. So Carter began to criticize abuses of human rights in other nations in his inaugural address. And this marked an ideological shift in U.S. foreign policy. During the early weeks of his administration, Officials spoke out against harassment and human rights violations in Czechoslovakia, in the Soviet Union, in Uganda. When asked at a January press conference if the January 77, this is like shortly after he was inaugurated, when asked at a press conference if the administration would continue to address specific human rights issues or exert quiet diplomatic pressure, Secretary of State Cyrus Vance explained that the United States will speak frankly about injustice, both at home and abroad, while avoiding strident and polemical language. Carter himself further defined these efforts in a series of public addresses delivered early in 1977. These speeches also afforded Carter the opportunity to explain why and how his administration promoted human rights. For example, he addressed the UN General Assembly in March of '77, and he asserted that the U.S. had a historical birthright to be associated with human rights. While the U.S. had not always lived up to this ideal, Carter identified several steps to rectify U.S. shortcomings quickly and openly, including the liberalization of travel policies and the signing and ratification of international human rights covenants. In May of that same year, '77, at a commencement address delivered at Notre Dame, Carter drew a distinction between his policy and the policies of his predecessors, noting that they had pursued the flawed and erroneous principles and tactics of our adversaries. As a result, the United States had moved away from its core values. The interdependent world of the 1970s required, quote, a new American foreign policy, grounded in the cardinal principles, including the commitment to human rights as a fundamental tenet of our foreign policy. The Notre Dame address served as a comprehensive statement and justification of Carter's human rights policy. This was a big change. And it was pursued by Clinton, and I would say Obama. The Republican presidents, Reagan, Bush, and Bush again, were less concerned in this area, but it depends on where your political leanings are. But I think many would acknowledge that taking a strong stand on human rights was a good thing to do and the right thing to do. And as the world's leading democracy, if we don't speak out against human rights abuses, who will? So I think that's to Carter's credit. Didn't earn him a lot of political points or brownie points, but he did it anyway. The last of his accomplishments, and for those of us who are supporters of Israel, is arguably the most significant to us, were the Camp David Accords. Right? Carter brought together Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat in September '78. And by March '79, you had this historic coming together where you had that handshake between Sadat and Begin, signing a peace treaty. Israel agreed to withdraw and did withdraw from the Sinai Desert at great cost, by the way. Israel had built advanced airfields in the Sinai. Israel had found oil in the Sinai. Israel had expended, if I remember correctly, about $3 billion on building assets in the Sinai. If you recall also some of the images, there were settlements that were built at the border between Sinai and Gaza, and Begin ordered them to be taken down. Yamit was the name of the settlement. You can Google and see videos. They were peaceful demonstrations by Israeli settlers. No physical confrontations with the soldiers. Sadat had wanted everything Israeli out of the Sinai, so they even dug up the graves in the community. And you should understand that these people who went to Yamit were the best of the best. They saw themselves serving a patriotic duty to guard the border. But this was a significant accomplishment. And it may have been a cold peace. The relationships between Israel and Egypt since have not always been warm, but there's been no war. And signing Camp David Accord cost Sadat his life. He was assassinated in '81 by Islamic extremists. Um, so you had Eisenstath's long list of accomplishments. The most notable, I think, are in foreign affairs, human rights, and Camp David. So, it begs the question, how do you assess a presidency? And I'm not sure how to answer that. In the end, the voters assess the presidency. They say, yes, we like the president, we want him to serve again, or they vote him out of office. Famously, despite the impeachment, at the end of his second term, Bill Clinton was as popular as he ever had been. And if the Constitution allowed for it, Bill Clinton could have won a third term of office. There's some who argue to this day that had Al Gore allowed Clinton to campaign for him in 2000, he would have won the election. Gore, of course, was offended perhaps by the Lewinsky affair, thought Clinton was radioactive, whatever reason. But in the end, historians can look at the record, but I think the voters make their own decisions. So Carter is an interesting individual as president and as a former president. He had many weaknesses, and he was not an effective president in the end, which is why he only served one office, despite him being very bright, despite him being very capable, despite him having the best intentions. And so I think the Carter presidency is worth reflecting on as we are in the run-up to the end of the first term of the Trump presidency. There might be a second term, there may not be. And depending on the outcome of the November election, the Carter example might be very relevant or might be very not relevant. We'll see. I'm not sure, as I said, if this ended up being one recording or two recordings. If it's two, I'll upload both to Facebook, and I hope you get to see both parts of it. Thank you for tuning in and listening to me, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture as much as I like giving it. Take care.